The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its hands moving forward, yet in this small bakery time seemed to stand still. A family, not born by blood but forged through shared moments, worked side by side, laughing, learning, and living. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air, but it wasn't the bread that made this place feel like home. It was the quiet understanding between them, the unspoken promise that they were no longer alone. But just as the warmth of the moment settled, a small, clumsy accident, an overturned bowl, a spill of flour broke the calm. For a second, the room held its breath. It was nothing really, but everything felt fragile. Could this simple mistake unravel everything? If you've ever found peace in the smallest of moments or wondered how life can shift in unexpected ways, consider giving this video a like and subscribing. There's a quiet kind of magic in these stories, and I'd love for you to be a part of it. David stood behind the counter of his small bakery, his hands moving automatically as he kneaded dough. The early morning sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, casting soft golden rays across the room. The bakery was quiet, almost too quiet except for the rhythmic sound of his hands pressing into the dough, the occasional shift of the oven, and the ticking of an old clock on the wall. There was no chatter, no laughter, no sound of little feet running around. Just the stillness that filled the space with a kind of heavy emptiness. The shelves, lined with mismatched mugs and delicate china, seemed to tell a story of a life once full of noise. Perhaps of a woman who had once helped him set the plates, or children who once begged for the cookies cooling on the counter. Each item was a quiet reminder of what had been. The chipped ceramic teapot, now gathering dust in the corner, held memories that no one would speak of anymore. David glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on a faded photograph of a woman tucked into a wooden frame on the counter. Her smile seemed frozen in time, a sharp contrast to the silence that enveloped the room now. He moved to the oven, pulling out the fresh batch of bread, the heat from the oven momentarily warming his face. But as the bread cooled, the warmth disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving only the cold of the morning behind. His hands continued to work without pause, folding, cutting, arranging. But his mind, like the empty bakery, drifted somewhere far away. In the quiet, there was only one constant, the echo of absence. It was a cold winter afternoon, the kind where the sun barely pierced through the thick gray clouds. The wind howled down the narrow street, sweeping snowflakes in chaotic spirals. David, busy arranging a fresh batch of pastries, didn't hear the car at first. The low rumble of an old engine interrupted the stillness, its tires crunching over the thick layer of snow. He glanced out the window, only to see an old, battered car slowly coming to a stop in front of the bakery. The windshield wipers worked frantically to clear the snow, but it seemed useless against the heavy storm. The door creaked open and a gust of cold air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of snow and something unfamiliar. Ella stepped inside first, her face pale and red from the cold, her coat tattered and worn. Behind her, 3 children followed, each one clutching a worn-out bag or coat. The youngest, a little boy with red cheeks, was clutching a small, empty plastic cup like it was the last thing he owned. The 2 older girls stood by their mother, their eyes wide and wary, as though they didn't know whether to speak or stay quiet. David froze for a moment, his mind raced, unsure of what to do. The place wasn't ready for guests, let alone for strangers seeking refuge. He hadn't had any visitors in weeks, just the usual quiet days and nights. He wasn't sure what they needed, but the desperation in Ella's eyes told him everything. She stepped forward slowly, almost as if to apologize for disturbing him. "I'm sorry. We need shelter. Just for a little while. We're not here to take anything," she said, her voice shaky, almost a whisper. David's heart softened despite the hesitation. He had nothing to offer, just the bakery, the warmth from the oven, and the quiet space he'd kept to himself for so long. but something inside him couldn't turn them away. "Come in," he said, his voice steady despite his surprise. "I've got some bread in the oven. You can stay until the storm passes." Ella blinked as though unsure whether she had heard him correctly. "You don't have to. I'm not offering charity," David interrupted, his tone firm but kind. "I'm offering warmth and food." Ella looked at him, her tired eyes searching his face as if trying to make sense of the offer. For a brief moment their gazes met, and something unspoken passed between them. An understanding, a simple act of kindness that needed no explanation. She nodded, her shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you. Thank you so much." David stepped aside, holding the door open for them. As they walked in, the warmth of the bakery seemed to welcome them, enveloping them in a sense of safety they hadn't known for a long time. The storm raged outside, but in here, for just a moment, the world felt a little softer. The light of the early morning had a silent, golden hue as it filtered through the frost-covered windows of David's bakery. The storm from the night before had finally passed, leaving behind a quiet stillness that seemed to settle over the world outside. Inside, the bakery was warm, the air thick with the comforting scent of rising dough and freshly brewed coffee. David moved around the small kitchen with practiced ease, preparing a simple breakfast, a pot of oatmeal on the stove, a tray of muffins cooling on the counter, and a stack of pancakes sizzling in the pan. As he worked, his thoughts were occupied with the unexpected guests that had come into his life just the night before. Ella, sitting at the worn wooden table with her children, watched David quietly as he moved from one task to the next. The two older girls, Maisie and Flora, sat beside their mother, their faces still weary from the journey, but their eyes softer now. Toby, the youngest, sat on the floor beside them, playing with a crumpled napkin, his little hands busy in his own quiet world. David glanced over at them occasionally, noticing how the children seemed hesitant to move, unsure of where they fit in this new space. They had only been with him for a few hours, but it felt like they had already become part of the rhythm of the bakery. It wasn't the noise or conversation that created the connection, but something gentler like the warmth of the oven, or the steady pulse of life in this small, quiet place. As he flipped a pancake, David turned to the counter where Ella had been sitting, her gaze on the table. "How do you take your coffee?" he asked, his voice steady, though there was a hint of warmth there that hadn't been present before. Ella looked up, startled by the question. She hadn't realized how much she'd been holding back until the simple act of someone offering to make her coffee felt like an opening, an invitation to rest, to stop running. "Black," she answered, her voice still raw from the night before. David nodded and set to work, filling the coffee pot. As the smell of fresh coffee filled the room, he saw Ella's shoulders relax just slightly, as if the warmth and care were seeping into her little by little. The children, after a few minutes, began to move, awkwardly at first. Maisie, the eldest, was the first to get up and help with the small tasks, setting the table, tidying up the corner. Flora followed, a little more hesitantly, picking up a stack of plates and placing them on the table. Even Toby, though he was still small, began mimicking his sisters, arranging napkins with careful precision. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was their way of contributing, their way of saying, "And we're here." David watched them work, silently grateful for their quiet help. There was no grand gesture, no overwhelming display of emotion, just simple actions that, in their own way, said everything. As they all gathered around the table to eat, the room was filled with the soft clink of spoons and the gentle hum of contentment. The storm was outside, far away now, and inside, there was just the feeling of being together, quiet, unspoken, but real. The children were still reserved, but there was an unspoken understanding between them all now. And for David, it was enough. Just for today, the world had become a little less lonely. The morning passed quietly with the steady rhythm of the bakery carrying on as usual. David worked at the counter arranging the fresh batch of pastries while Ella and the children slowly settled into the space around him. The scent of cinnamon and fresh bread seemed to hang in the air. But there was an underlying tension, an unspoken discomfort, especially in Emma's eyes. Emma sat at the small wooden table, her chin resting on her hand, staring into the empty space. Her usually bright eyes were dulled, distant, and though she'd helped clean up after breakfast, her movements were stiff, mechanical. She couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest since Ella and her kids had arrived. David glanced over at her, noticing the way Emma seemed to shrink into herself whenever one of the children approached. Maisie, the oldest, was sitting near the window watching the snow fall while Flora and Toby played quietly with the toys David had set aside for them. But Emma stayed on the edge of the room, hesitant, as if she didn't know where to fit in this new family dynamic. The sudden noise of a toy dropping onto the floor broke her thoughts, and Emma flinched, her body tensing. Toby looked up, a confused expression on his face. "It's okay," he said softly, walking over to pick up the toy. Emma gave a small, awkward smeary, but it didn't reach her eyes. She didn't know how to talk to them, not to these strangers who now filled up the space of her home. It wasn't that she didn't want to connect, she just didn't know how. There was too much change happening too fast, too many questions and too few answers. Flora, watching Emma from across the room, stood up slowly and walked over to her. She had a quiet confidence that made her seem older than her years. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice soft. "Do you like playing music?" she asked, looking at Emma's violin case resting by her side. Emma glanced up at Flora, surprised by the question. Her violin was something she hadn't touched in days, the case sitting untouched like an old friend she had forgotten how to talk to. She hadn't played since her mom passed away. Too many memories, too much pain. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she nodded slowly, unsure of how to explain the ache that music used to soothe. Flora smiled gently, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "I like listening to music," she said, and Emma, for the first time that day, felt a slight easing in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small bridge between the quiet walls Emma had built and the family that was slowly, silently becoming a part of her world. Later in the morning, as the children played and David continued working, Emma stood up and walked over to the corner where the violin rested. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the case, but then she slowly unlatched it, pulling out the instrument. She ran her fingers across the strings, tuning it softly. The sound of the violin, though quiet, seemed to fill the bakery with a warmth that had been missing earlier. It wasn't perfect, just a few hesitant notes, but it was a beginning. David, catching the faint melody, glanced over at Emma. He could see the way her shoulders had loosened, the way her eyes had softened as she played. It was the first time in days that she seemed to breathe a little easier. Emma looked up, her face flushing with embarrassment, but her eyes held something different now. Hope, even if it was only a sliver. Flora and Maisie, who had been sitting at the table, looked up at Emma, both of them smiling softly. "Good job," Maisie said quietly, giving Emma an encouraging nod. Emma smiled, this time more naturally, and for the first time since they had arrived, there was no hesitation. She wasn't just playing music, she was beginning to let the music heal something inside of her. In the quiet, the bakery felt a little warmer, and the connection between the family felt a little stronger. David looked over at Ella, who was quietly watching her children. He could see the same thing happening for them, a slow, steady shift from uncertainty to something a little more certain. This, he realized, was how healing happened, not in grand gestures, but in small moments, shared silences, and a few gentle notes of music. Emma, still holding her violin, glanced out the window at the falling snow. She didn't know where this journey would take her, but for now, it felt like the first step. The phone rang in the quiet of the bakery, its sharp ring cutting through the hum of the oven. Tessa glanced over at it, her hand hovering over the dough she was shaping. She wiped her hands on her apron before walking across the room to pick up the receiver. "Hello?" she answered, trying to keep the hesitation out of her voice. "Hi, is this Tessa Walker?" A woman's voice came through, bright and eager. "Yes, this is Tessa. This is Laura Bennett from East Coast Culinary in New York. I'm calling about your application. We were really impressed with your portfolio, and we'd love to offer you a position at our flagship bakery. It's an incredible opportunity, and we think you'd be a perfect fit. We're looking to have you join us in the next few weeks if you're available." Tessa felt her breath catch in her throat. She hadn't expected this. New York, the big city, the world she had once dreamed of being a part of, where opportunities like this didn't come often. Her heart raced as she listened to the details, the excitement in Laura's voice palpable even through the phone. The woman continued to speak, but Tessa's mind wasn't fully on the words. She was already lost in a whirlwind of thoughts. The city, the bright lights, the promise of new beginnings, all of it was within reach. This was the fresh start she had been silently hoping for. The chance to escape the stagnation that had slowly crept into her life. But then her eyes drifted across the room to the table where Ella and her children sat, eating quietly. They had been here for a few weeks now, and the connection they had started to build wasn't something she had anticipated. She could still remember the first day Ella and the kids had arrived, the coldness of the storm outside and the uncertainty in Ella's eyes as she asked for shelter. Tessa had opened her door, offered them a meal, not knowing how much they would come to mean to her. Ella's children, Maisie, Flora, and Toby, each of them, in their own way, had brought something into her life that she hadn't realized was missing. There was a warmth, a softness that had slowly settled into the corners of the bakery, making it feel less empty. "Are you still there?" Laura's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. Tessa blinked, feeling the weight of the decision settle in her chest. "Yes, I'm here," she replied, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "I'm honored, truly, but I need a moment to think about it. Can I get back to you soon?" "Of course, take your time. But I do hope you'll consider it. We really think you'll thrive here." Tessa hung up the phone slowly, her hand lingering on the receiver. She stood there for a moment, feeling the silence around her. The quiet buzz of the refrigerator, the low hum of the oven. She looked at Ella, who was speaking softly to her children, their laughter filling the room in a way that made the place feel alive. Tessa thought about how much they had already shared, the quiet moments over meals, the early mornings when they worked together in the kitchen. She thought about how much it would hurt to walk away from all of this, to leave behind the connection she had found with Ella and her family. The offer in New York was a dream, a chance to escape, to build something for herself, something bigger. But could she really leave this behind? Could she walk away from the small, unexpected family that had started to form here? Tessa turned away from the window, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on her shoulders. She didn't have an answer yet, but she knew that whatever choice she made, it wouldn't be an easy one. The thought of leaving was painful, but the thought of staying meant something she hadn't realized. She longed for belonging. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel quite so alone. The bakery was quiet now, the warm glow of the lights casting long shadows on the walls. The oven, now turned off, hummed faintly in the background, a soft reminder of the day's work. Outside, the world was cloaked in darkness, the streets covered in snow, the only sound the occasional gust of wind brushing past the window panes. Tessa sat at the worn wooden counter, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of a chipped cup. The cup was one of the mismatched ones she had collected over the years, each one with its own story, just like the bakery itself, a collection of things she had accumulated but never quite made her own. Her mind wandered as it often did when the day's bustle faded into the stillness. She thought about the phone call from New York. The opportunity, so big and shiny, felt almost like a dream, but it wasn't just about the job. It was about everything that had come before, the quiet loneliness, the way she had spent years trying to outrun her own shadow, building a life around her work but never truly living. The quiet hum of the bakery seemed to match the quiet in her heart. She had built this place from the ground up, but in doing so, she had built walls around herself too. It was easy to lose yourself in something, to let it become your whole identity. The bakery was her refuge, but also her prison. She had thrown herself into it, working long hours, refusing to face the loneliness that crept in at night. She leaned back in the chair, her gaze falling on the faded photograph on the counter. Her mother, young and smiling, holding Tessa as a child. It had been taken years ago, before Tessa had moved away, before she had tried to carve out a life for herself far away from the small town where everything felt too familiar, too confining. Tessa had never truly understood the weight of her mother's life, the sacrifices she had made for Tessa and her father. But now, sitting alone in the quiet, Tessa could feel it, the same weight settling into her own chest. She had lived a life of survival, not living fully, just getting by, hiding behind the walls she had built to protect herself. The phone call from New York felt like a lifeline pulling her towards something bigger, something that could define her in ways that the bakery never had. But as she sat there, listening to the wind outside, she realized that she had spent so many years trying to outrun herself, to escape the past, that she had never really given herself a chance to live. She had spent so many years holding on to the memory of the life she thought she was supposed to have. But here now, with Ella and her children, Tessa was beginning to see something she hadn't been able to before, what it meant to share, to open yourself to others, to be part of something that wasn't just about survival. Her thoughts drifted to Ella, to the quiet strength she had seen in her when Ella had arrived at the bakery with her children, broken but still fighting. Tessa had opened her door without hesitation, offering them shelter, and in doing so, she had unknowingly started opening herself up as well. It was as though the past few weeks had cracked open a door she had closed long ago. Ella and the kids were not just temporary visitors in her life. They were a reminder of something she had forgotten. The importance of connection, of being vulnerable, of letting others in. Tessa closed her eyes, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. The thought of leaving felt heavy, like abandoning something that had started to feel like home. The thought of staying was equally difficult, because staying meant confronting everything she had avoided for so long, facing the part of herself she had kept buried. The wind outside howled louder now, and Tessa stood, her legs stiff from sitting too long. She walked to the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she stared out into the darkened street. It was so quiet, so still, and yet she felt a shift inside of her. Something small but undeniable. She didn't have the answers yet, but she knew she couldn't keep running. Not anymore. The choices ahead of her weren't just about a job in New York or staying here. They were about something deeper, something she had been avoiding for far too long. For the first time, she felt the quiet stirrings of hope. Not hope for the future or for a specific outcome, but the hope that maybe, just maybe, she could finally start living for herself. She could stop running from the past, stop hiding behind the walls she had built, and maybe, just maybe, she could find a place right here, in this small bakery with Ella and the children, where she could finally be whole. The morning light crept through the small bakery windows, casting soft rays across the counters and the carefully arranged shelves. The storm from the night before had passed, and the world outside looked calm, blanketed in fresh snow. Inside, The bakery hummed with a quiet, comforting warmth. The faint smell of freshly baked bread lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of strong coffee brewing in the corner. Tessa stood behind the counter, her hands moving mechanically as she worked, but her mind wasn't focused on the dough in front of her or the familiar routine. Her thoughts kept returning to the phone call, the one she had received just a few days ago from New York, offering her the position she had always dreamed of. The offer was tempting, no doubt. A new beginning, a chance to start over in a big city where opportunities waited at every corner. It promised excitement, recognition, and a future full of possibility. It was everything she had told herself she needed. But as Tessa stood there, listening to the quiet buzz of the bakery and looking over at the small table where Ella and her children sat, something inside her shifted. She hadn't realized it before, but these last few weeks had changed her. Ella and the kids had come into her life unexpectedly, and in their own quiet way, they had begun to fill the spaces that had been empty for so long. It wasn't the big moments or dramatic gestures that had made a difference. It was the little things, the shared meals, the quiet conversations, the way Ella's children had found their own rhythm in the bakery. They had become part of her world, part of the heartbeat of this small, humble place. Tessa glanced toward the corner where the old wooden clock ticked steadily, its hands moving in rhythm with the passing minutes. It had been a gift from her mother, one of the few things Tessa had kept after leaving home. She had always seen it as nothing more than an object, something that marked the passing of time, an old family heirloom that had no real significance. But now, as she stood there, it seemed to hold a different meaning. Time, she realized, was more than just the hours ticking away. It was a collection of moments, quiet, fleeting, but somehow significant. The moments she had spent with Ella and the kids, the ones that had quietly reawakened something inside of her, were as valuable as anything else. For so long, she had been chasing something that felt like an escape. She had been running from the pain of the past, from the loneliness that had become her constant companion. The offer from New York had promised a new life, but it wasn't the life she wanted anymore. The life she had found here in this small bakery was real, messy, imperfect, but real. Tessa set the dough aside and walked over to the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she looked outside. The quiet of the world, the stillness of the snow-covered street, felt comforting. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something else to happen, something bigger. She felt anchored, as if she were finally where she was supposed to be. The clock ticked on, each second a small reminder that time wasn't just something to escape from. It was something to be lived, cherished, and shared. And in this bakery with Ella and her children, she had found something that was worth staying for. Tessa turned back to the counter, her decision clear in her heart. She wasn't going to take the job in New York. She was going to stay, to build something here, with them. It wasn't the future she had envisioned, but it was the one that felt right. The clock continued to tick, and Tessa realized that this moment, this quiet, simple moment, was what truly mattered. Time was not just a measurement of passing days, it was a collection of the people, the moments, the choices that shaped a life. And in this life, here with them, she had found a place to call home. The bakery had come to life again, with the warmth of shared work. David stood at the counter, kneading dough with his usual focus, but today there was a quiet energy in the air. Something different. Ella, standing nearby, was carefully placing loaves of bread into the oven, her hands moving with an ease that came from years of doing the same thing, though she had never worked in a bakery before. David glanced over at her, noticing how the simple tasks they were doing together made the room feel fuller. Ella had joined him in the kitchen, not just as a guest, but as someone contributing, as part of the rhythm of the place. It was a small thing, yet it felt monumental. The bakery wasn't just his anymore, it was becoming theirs. Tessa watched from the side, her hands still wrapped around a rolling pin, though her thoughts were far from the dough in front of her. She had never imagined how quickly Ella would fit in, how seamlessly she had stepped into their world. But what surprised her more was how comfortable she felt with it, how natural it seemed. It wasn't the way things had always been. It wasn't the solitary routine she was used to. But there was something about the way they worked together. David, Ella, and even the children that felt right. They didn't need to say much. Their actions spoke volumes. Tessa glanced at the children as they moved around the room, helping in their own small ways. Maisie was folding napkins at the table, Flora was arranging jars of flour on the shelves, and Toby, with his small hands, was busy sweeping the floor. His face focused in a way that made Tessa smile. The quiet determination in their movements reminded her of something of the way a family should be. Ella looked over at Tessa, catching her eye. There was a softness in her expression that spoke of gratitude, of quiet relief. "Do you mind if I try something with the dough?" Ella asked, a tentative smile tugging at the corners of her lips. David, busy with the next batch of pastries, didn't seem to notice the exchange, but Tessa did. She saw how Ella had found a place here, how she was no longer the stranger who had walked through the door weeks ago, but someone who had become integral to this small world. "Go ahead," Tessa replied, her voice carrying the kind of warmth she hadn't realized she was capable of until recently. Ella began working with the dough, her hands gentle but confident. Tessa watched her for a moment longer, then turned back to the counter, her own hands resuming their work. The rhythm of the kitchen had changed. What had once been a solitary mechanical routine for Tessa was now a shared experience. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable. There was laughter now, even if it was soft, even if it was just the children joking about who had the better loaf of bread. There was life in the space, something Tessa hadn't noticed was missing until it had begun to fill the room again. As the morning wore on, the bakery became a quiet sanctuary of sorts. The family worked together, moving in unison, each person contributing their part. There was no grandiose effort, no loud declarations, it was simply life, unfolding in small, meaningful ways. Tessa found herself smiling at the children's antics, at the way they teased each other as they worked, or the way Ella made small adjustments to the dough, laughing when she got it wrong. These small moments, these shared tasks, began to feel like the things that made a family, not the big gestures or grand promises. As the sun moved higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the wooden floors, Tessa realized something. She had been so focused on the idea of what she wanted her life to be, what she thought it should look like. But now, with Ella and the kids, with David's quiet strength beside her, Tessa saw that maybe this, the life they were building together, was all she truly needed. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale. But it was real, and that was enough. For the first time in a long while, Tessa didn't feel the need to chase something outside of herself. She didn't need to keep running toward something bigger. What she had right here with this imperfect but beautiful family was enough to fill the spaces she had long ignored. The bakery, once a solitary place, was now filled with life. And as Tessa glanced at the smiling faces around her, she realized something else too. This wasn't just a bakery anymore. It was home, and it was enough. The bakery was a different place now, filled with the soft hum of voices and the occasional laughter of children. The work had become more than just a way to pass the time. It had become a way of connecting, a way of being together. David, Ella, and the three children worked side by side, their movements slowly blending into a seamless rhythm. David had always worked alone, the quiet of his own company a constant companion. But now, as he kneaded dough at the counter, he felt something change. He wasn't alone anymore. Ella's presence, steady and quiet, seemed to fill the spaces that had once felt too empty. She was no longer a guest in his life. She was part of it. Ella had begun to share bits of her own story, little details about her life before she arrived at the bakery. At first, it had been tentative, just a few words here and there, but as the days went on, she opened up more. "The kids, they used to laugh all the time," Ella said one morning as she worked alongside David, chopping herbs for a fresh batch of soup. "It's funny, I always thought their laughter was just something normal. But after everything, I realize now just how precious it was. How much I missed hearing it." David looked up from the counter, his hands still working the dough. He understood what she meant, the sound of the kids playing, running around, filling the bakery with noise. It was something he had never fully appreciated until now. He nodded, a quiet understanding between them. The children, too, had begun to open up in their own ways. Maisie, the eldest, often sat with Tessa at the small table by the window, flipping through old recipe books and asking questions about baking. Flora would quietly help with the dishes, her little hands working carefully, while Toby, still too young to help much, would sit near David, mimicking him as he moved around the kitchen. Even though they didn't always say much, the way the family shared these small moments working together, laughing together, made the bakery feel more alive than it ever had before. Tessa watched them from across the room, her own hands moving mechanically as she cut vegetables for the stew. She had seen the way Ella's face softened when her children laughed, the way her shoulders seemed to relax as they worked together. It was like watching a family come back to life, piece by piece. And in those moments, Tessa realized that this, the quiet joy of simply being together, was the healing she had been looking for. It wasn't the big moments that made the difference. It was the small ones, the ones that didn't make headlines or take center stage. She had watched David and Ella share stories about their pasts. David speaking of his late wife, Annie, in a quiet voice, and Ella telling tales of the days when her own family was whole. The stories weren't grand, but they were real, filled with grief, loss, and hope. They weren't trying to fix each other, they were simply acknowledging the past and moving forward together. Tessa had never realized how much of her own life she had kept hidden, how much of herself she had buried behind her work and her walls. But now, seeing the way Ella and David shared their vulnerabilities, Tessa found herself starting to let go of her own. One evening, as the bakery started to quiet down and the last of the customers trickled out, Tessa found herself sitting at the counter with Ella, sipping the last of the coffee. The children were outside, playing in the fading light of the day. "I never thought I'd be here," Ella said softly, her eyes far away. "I thought I was running from everything, from the pain, but maybe this place, this family, it's where I was meant to be." Tessa smiled, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I think we all are," she said quietly. Ella turned to her, their eyes meeting for a moment, and for the first time there was no hesitation between them. Just understanding. Just the knowledge that even in the mess of life, they had found something worth holding on to. David appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on his apron, looking tired but content. The kids were gathering their things, the sound of their laughter drifting in from outside. As Tessa sat there, feeling the warmth of the moment settle around her, she realized something she hadn't before. This wasn't just a place of work. This was a place of healing. And though the wounds of the past wouldn't disappear overnight, these simple moments shared in the quiet of the bakery, in the laughter of children, in the stories of those who had lived through it all were enough. For the first time in a long time, Tessa felt the weight of the world lighten, if only just for a little while. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. And in this quiet, simple way, so were they all. The bakery had become a second home for the family. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting soft, golden beams across the flour-dusted counters. The rhythm of the day had shifted, no longer just about the quiet hum of the oven or the steady clink of cups. Now there was laughter, a gentle yet unmistakable sound that filled the space with warmth. David had always kept to himself, but now, as he worked alongside Ella and her children, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The once lonely corners of the bakery were now full of life. The children, Maisie, Flora, and little Toby, had begun to feel at ease in this new place, and their hesitance had slowly faded away. But the most significant change had been in the way they began to interact with David. One afternoon, as David worked at the counter preparing a fresh batch of rolls, he felt a small hand tugging at his apron. He looked down to find Toby wide-eyed, his hands covered in flour. "Bah, I want to help," Toby said, his voice full of determination. David paused for a moment, his heart tightening at the word. He hadn't expected this, didn't even know if he was ready for it. But something in Toby's innocent request made him smile. He crouched down, meeting the little boy's gaze. "All right, little man," David said, his voice softer than usual. "Let's make some bread together." Toby's face lit up with a grin that stretched from ear to ear. He jumped up and down, eager to be a part of something, and David couldn't help but feel a swell of emotion. In that moment, something shifted inside of him. These children, who had once been strangers, were now his family. The word Ba felt like more than just a title. It felt like a promise, a bond that was quietly forming with each passing day. Meanwhile, Emma, still reserved but slowly opening up, found herself sitting next to Maisie, who was flipping through an old recipe book. Maisie looked up and smiled at her, her expression welcoming and warm. "Do you want to try making something?" Maisie asked, handing Emma the book. "You're really good with recipes, aren't you?" Emma hesitated at first, unsure of how to respond. But something in Maisie's easygoing manner made her feel at ease. She glanced down at the book, then back at Maisie, and finally nodded. "Okay," she said, a quiet smile playing on her lips. "Let's make something together." The act of working side by side with Maisie was a quiet step forward for Emma. She had spent so many years avoiding connections, afraid of getting too close to anyone. But here, with Maisie, something different was happening. There was no pressure, no expectation, just two people sharing a simple task. David looked over at them as he kneaded the dough with Toby at his side. The small, simple moments like this, these shared experiences, were what made a family. No grand gestures, no dramatic confessions, just the slow, steady work of being together. By the afternoon, the bakery had transformed into a bustling, lively space. The family worked in harmony, each person contributing in their own way. David and Toby were shaping the bread, Ella was organizing the ingredients, and the girls, Maisie, Flora, and Emma, were busy cleaning the tables and arranging the shelves. There was a new sense of order in the place, not just in the work being done, but in the way everyone had taken responsibility for the space. As the last batch of cookies came out of the oven, David stepped back and looked around the room. The children were laughing, their faces lit with the joy of being part of something real, something that mattered. Even Emma, who had been so quiet when they first arrived, was now engaged, sharing jokes with the girls as they worked together. "You know," David said as he wiped his hands on his apron, "I think this is the best batch we've made." Everyone laughed, and Emma, for the first time, seemed genuinely at ease. She caught David's eye, and for a brief moment there was a shared understanding between them. An unspoken acknowledgement that yes, they were family now. As the day came to a close and the last of the customers left, the bakery felt different. There was still flour on the floor, crumbs scattered across the tables, and a few mismatched mugs that hadn't been put away. But there was something more, a quiet joy in the way they had all worked together. the way they had shared this small piece of their lives with each other. David, looking at the children, feeling the weight of the word "ba" in his heart, realized that this was what he had been waiting for. This was the family he hadn't known he needed. They were messy, imperfect, and far from what he had imagined. But in that imperfection, there was something beautiful, something worth holding on to. And as Tessa looked around the room, seeing how everyone had found their place, she realized something too. This simple shared life was what she had been searching for. Not a new beginning in some faraway city, but the quiet, steady warmth of a family that had found its way back to each other. The sun had long set, casting the bakery in a soft glow as the evening rush began to quiet down. The air was filled with the usual hum of the oven cooling and the soft chatter of the family working together. But tonight, something felt different. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere that Tessa couldn't ignore. David was at the counter, carefully icing a batch of pastries while Ella organized some of the jars in the back. The children, as always, were helping with small tasks. Maisie wiping down the tables, Flora and Toby putting the last of the baking utensils away. Everything seemed calm, but something in the air felt heavier than usual. Tessa could feel it too. The smallest of things, a slight change in the usual rhythm, was enough to make her stomach tighten with unease. She had been standing by the counter, trying to organize the receipts, but her mind was racing. She glanced at the oven, then at the shelves, and then back to the family, as if checking to make sure everything was in its right place. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the back. Tessa's heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly to see Toby, who had knocked over a stack of mixing bowls onto the floor. The sound echoed through the bakery, breaking the fragile quiet. David immediately moved toward him, kneeling down to help Toby pick up the bowls, but the tension was already thick in the air. The children had stopped what they were doing, and Emma, who had been quietly washing the dishes, looked up at the scene, her face momentarily frozen with worry. Tessa's breath caught in her chest. It was such a small accident, and yet it felt like everything was teetering on the edge. It wasn't just the bowls, something deeper had shifted. Something more fragile, like the delicate balance they had all found together, was suddenly out of place. David looked up at her, his expression calm but his voice tight. "It's all right, Tessa. He didn't mean to." Tessa nodded, but inside, she felt a growing pressure. The bakery, once her quiet sanctuary, was starting to feel like a place where every move was under scrutiny. The weight of keeping everything running smoothly, of making sure everyone was happy and safe and contributing, was starting to feel like too much. Emma moved toward her, sensing the tension. "It's okay, Tessa," she said softly. "We're all doing our part. It'll be fine." But Tessa couldn't shake the feeling that she was failing. She had been trying so hard to hold it all together. Her responsibilities as a mother figure to the children, her role in the bakery, and the constant pull to make everything work, to make everything right. The weight of the family, the business, the uncertainty. It was all on her shoulders now, and in that moment it felt too heavy. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the reality was unavoidable. She couldn't do this alone. As the noise of the children cleaning up the mess settled into the background, Tessa turned back to the counter, her hands still holding the receipts she had been trying to organize. Her mind was cluttered, and she felt herself beginning to spin, overwhelmed by the constant juggling of tasks. David noticed the shift in her, the way her shoulders had tensed and her hands had stilled. He moved closer, his voice low, just for her ears. "Tessa, you don't have to do everything." Tessa looked up at him, surprised by his words. She had always prided herself on managing things alone, doing everything on her own terms. But here, in this space that was meant to be a home, it felt as if she had been carrying the weight of the world, without asking for help. "I'm just trying to keep everything together," she murmured. the words feeling heavy on her tongue. David didn't say anything at first. He just stood beside her, waiting for her to meet his gaze. "You don't have to carry it all," he repeated softly. "We're a family now, Tessa, and we all carry a part of it. You don't have to do this alone." Tessa felt a tightness in her chest at his words. She had been so afraid of being vulnerable, so afraid of letting anyone else take responsibility. But in that moment, she realized how much she had been holding on to without asking for help. Looking over at the children, Maisie, who was still wiping down the tables, Flora carefully putting the bowls back into place, and even Toby, who was standing quietly by David, Tessa saw it. They weren't just helping, they were invested. They were part of this too, whether she had realized it or not. It wasn't just her burden to carry. It wasn't just her job to make sure everything was perfect. They were a team, a family in the truest sense of the word. David smiled at her, his expression soft and reassuring. "Let us help. We're all in this together." Tessa looked at him, her chest feeling lighter than it had in days. For the first time, she felt the pressure ease, if only slightly. She didn't have to shoulder it all on her own. She wasn't alone in this anymore. The children, unaware of the weight of Tessa's thoughts, continued working, each of them doing their part. The bakery, once a solitary space, was now a place of shared responsibility. And for the first time in a long time, Tessa felt a quiet relief, knowing that she wasn't alone in carrying the weight of the world. The bakery was filled with the low murmur of voices as everyone began to pitch in, working together to clean up the mess Toby had made. It was a simple task, picking up the broken bowls, sweeping the flour dust from the floor, straightening the shelves, but the act of doing it together felt like more than just restoring order to the space. It felt like a small but significant moment of unity. David moved with quiet authority, guiding Toby gently to help him pick up the shards of the broken bowl. He showed him how to be careful, teaching him the responsibility that came with making a mistake, but also with taking ownership of the solution. Toby was quiet, his small hands awkwardly fumbling with the pieces, but David's patience never wavered. "It's okay, buddy. We clean it up together, right?" David said softly, offering a reassuring smile as he helped Toby place the broken pieces into the trash. The children were learning more than just how to clean up. They were learning how to work as a team, how to contribute not just with their hands, but with their hearts. Maisie and Flora had already moved on to wiping down the countertops, their usual banter filling the space as they jokingly debated who could get the countertops cleaner. Tessa watched them all as they moved around the bakery, and for the first time she felt a sense of belonging. It wasn't just the noise or the bustle that had changed the atmosphere. It was the way they all fit together, how they filled the gaps that had once felt so empty. "Everything looks good now," David said, surveying the space once they had finished cleaning. "Now we make it better." He turned to Maisie and Flora. "Come on, girls, let's prep for tomorrow's batch. Toby, can you help with the frosting?" Toby nodded enthusiastically, clearly eager to contribute in his own way. He carefully took a bowl of frosting and began to spread it on the pastries, focusing with all his attention. David glanced at Tessa, who was still standing by the counter watching the scene unfold. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The family, once strangers in each other's lives, were now working side by side, no longer just helping in the bakery, but helping each other in ways that were far deeper. Tessa felt a tug in her chest, an unexpected warmth that spread through her body. She hadn't realized how much she needed this simple act of working together, of seeing everyone take part in building something meaningful. She joined them at the counter, rolling up her sleeves and picking up a pastry tray. "I'll help with the frosting," she said, her voice steady. The sound of the oven's hum filled the room as they worked together. the clink of spatulas and the soft laughter of the children creating a kind of harmony that had been missing before. Tessa had always been the one to take charge, the one to make sure everything was perfect, but now, for the first time, she felt like she could let go. She glanced over at David as he worked beside her, his hands moving effortlessly. He had always been there, steady and calm, guiding the children with the same patience and care he had shown them since their arrival. She admired his quiet strength, the way he never seemed to ask for anything in return, how he just gave without hesitation. As the evening wore on, the bakery became a space of shared tasks and mutual respect. David taught the children not just how to bake, but how to care for each other. They worked together without expectation, without the pressure of perfection. It was about the process, about being together, about sharing the load. Tessa felt the weight of responsibility slowly lift from her shoulders. It wasn't that she had stopped caring. It was that she had learned to share the burden, to trust the people around her to do their part. She wasn't alone in this anymore. She didn't have to carry the weight of the world by herself. She watched as Maisie carefully arranged the pastries. Flora organized the ingredients, and Toby laughed, frosting cupcakes with the kind of joy that could only come from doing something he loved. And in that moment, Tessa realized something deep within her. The change wasn't just happening in the bakery, it was happening inside of her too. The walls she had built around herself, the walls that had kept her distant and self-reliant, were beginning to crumble. She was no longer fighting alone. She was part of something bigger, something that felt like it could last. As the last tray of pastries was placed in the oven, David stood back and looked around at the family gathered in the bakery. "Good work, everyone," he said with a smile. "I'm proud of you." Tessa watched him, her heart swelling with a quiet sense of gratitude. She was proud too, proud of herself for letting go, proud of the family they had become. They had worked together, not just to bake bread or frost cupcakes, but to create something that mattered, something that would last. And for the first time, Tessa felt the certainty that this was the life she had been waiting for. The bakery was quiet now, the last few customers having left for the night. The familiar hum of the oven cooling was the only sound that filled the room, and the soft golden light of the overhead lamps created a peaceful atmosphere. Tessa stood by the counter, her hands resting gently on the edge, and her eyes were drawn to the old clock hanging on the wall. A gift from her mother that had always marked the passage of time in the bakery. She had never really paid attention to it before, never given it much thought beyond its role as a reminder of time passing. But tonight, standing in the silence of the bakery, Tessa felt differently. The clock's steady ticking seemed to echo in her chest, and for the first time it felt like more than just a relic of the past. It felt like a symbol of the journey she had been on, of the time that had healed her piece by piece, even when she hadn't noticed it happening. Her thoughts drifted back to the early days after Ella and the kids had arrived. How uncertain and fragile everything had felt. She had been hesitant, afraid of letting them in, afraid of the vulnerability that came with opening her life to others. She had kept her distance, buried in her work, thinking that if she could just keep moving, keep pushing forward, the hurt would fade. But over time, as the days stretched into weeks, something had shifted. The noise of the bakery, once an echo of loneliness, had turned into something else. A quiet hum of life, filled with laughter and conversation, shared moments of warmth. David had quietly shown her how to let go, how to share the burden of the bakery and unknowingly the burden of her heart. The children had found their place here too. Maisie, Flora, and little Toby, each of them in their own way, had become a part of her world. They weren't just guests anymore. They were family. And with them came Ella, whose quiet strength and steady presence had helped Tessa face the wounds she had hidden for so long. Tessa glanced at the clock again. its hands ticking steadily, and in that moment it was as if the weight of the past few months had finally settled into her chest. The time had passed, and with it something had healed. She wasn't the same person who had opened the door to Ella and the kids. She wasn't the same person who had shut herself off from connection. Now, standing there in the quiet of the bakery, Tessa realized something she hadn't truly acknowledged before. Time hadn't just passed. It had given her the space she needed to find something she had lost, the ability to connect, to love, and to be loved. She wasn't alone anymore, and in the small, simple moments of working together, of sharing meals, of laughing with the children, she had found something real, something lasting. Tessa reached out and touched the old clock, her fingers grazing the surface. It was more than just a timepiece. It was a reminder of how far she had come, how far they had all come. Her eyes turned to David, who was putting the last of the dishes away. His quiet strength had become the anchor for their small family. And she realized for the first time how deeply she had come to rely on him, on Ella, on the children. "This place, this family," Tessa whispered to herself, a soft smile pulling at the corners of her lips. She felt a warmth in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't sure when it had happened, but she knew now that she had found it. The family she had always longed for wasn't something distant or out of reach. It was here. It was now. And it had been built slowly over time with small acts of kindness, with laughter, with shared work, and most importantly, with the willingness to be vulnerable. As the clock ticked on, Tessa felt a sense of peace settle over her. The time had healed her, and in its passage, she had found a place to call home. The bakery had settled into a rhythm that felt like a dance. The morning rush had passed, and now the quiet of the evening enveloped them as everyone worked side by side. The air was filled with the comforting scents of fresh dough, cinnamon, and vanilla, a soft hum of the oven in the background. David stood at the counter, rolling out dough with an ease that came from years of practice. Ella, beside him, was shaping the dough into the familiar round loaves that filled the bakery with their warmth. The children, too, had found their place, Maisie carefully cutting cookies with a small knife, Flora measuring out ingredients with the precision of someone much older, and Toby with a bowl of flour in his hands, trying his best to help, though most of the flour ended up on the floor. There was laughter in the air, soft and genuine, the children's chatter as they worked, the occasional playful argument about who could frost the best cupcake, and the way David's calm voice guided them all. It was a sound Tessa had never realized she'd been missing. For the first time, there was no tension, no pressure. It wasn't just the work they were doing. It was the way they were doing it together. Each person had their part to play, and there was no rush, no feeling of being overwhelmed. It was the simplest of things, but it felt like the world had slowed down just for them. Tessa stood at the corner of the counter, watching them all. There was a softness in her chest, a quiet realization that this was what she had been longing for. The family she had built, unknowingly at first, was right here. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. David caught her gaze and smiled as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. "We're almost there," he said, his voice steady, a hint of pride in his eyes as he looked around at the children working beside him. Tessa smiled back, feeling the weight in her chest lift. For once, she wasn't worried about keeping everything in order. They were making it together. Once the last batch of pastries was out of the oven, they sat down at the small wooden table in the back of the bakery. It wasn't much, a simple meal of soup, bread, and the fresh cookies they had just baked together, but it felt like a feast. Everyone gathered around the table, the laughter still in the air as they passed dishes around. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily without the usual awkwardness that had marked their early days together. Ella talked about her hopes for the future, about what she dreamed of for her children, how she wanted them to grow up surrounded by love, not fear. Maisie, sitting across from Tessa, spoke up next, her voice a little shy but clear. "I want to be a baker when I'm older," she said, looking down at her hands, as if the idea was still new but very real. "But I want to bake for everyone like this, like we're all part of something." David smiled at her, his eyes soft. "You will be, Maisie. I know you will." Flora added, her voice strong and confident for someone so young. "I want to help everyone feel welcome, like how this place made us feel when we came here." Toby, who had been quietly eating his bread, looked up with wide eyes. "And I want to make cookies for everyone," he added simply, the sincerity in his words making everyone smile. Tessa sat back in her chair, watching them all. It wasn't just the words they were saying, but the way they were saying them. There was no hesitation, no doubt. It was as if, in this small space, they had all found their place in the world. Ella caught Tessa's gaze, and for the first time there was no distance between them. No walls, no guarded looks, just understanding. "I never thought it could be like this," Ella said quietly, her voice almost a whisper but filled with so much meaning. "I didn't think I could ever feel at home again, after everything. But here, with all of you, it feels right." Tessa nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She had thought she was just offering them shelter, a place to stay until they figured things out. But in doing so, she had unknowingly opened the door to her own healing, to her own sense of belonging. This is what family feels like," Tessa said, her voice soft but sure. The words felt right. The rest of the table was quiet, the weight of her words settling in, as if they all understood the magnitude of the moment. They were a family now, not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the simple acts of working together and sharing dreams, however big or small. Tessa reached out and touched the hand of the person next to her, David, who had been the quiet strength at the heart of it all. And as their hands met, there was an unspoken promise that everything they had worked for, everything they had shared, would carry them forward. In that moment, as the last of the light dimmed outside and the quiet of the evening surrounded them, Tessa realized something. They had found their way, not just to each other, but to something greater, a shared future built on trust, love, and the simple joy of being together. This, she thought, was home. The kitchen was still bathed in the soft light of the evening. The hum of the oven had quieted, and the last few crumbs of the day's work lay scattered across the counter. David stood at the sink, wiping his hands slowly, his gaze drifting to the old clock on the wall. It ticked steadily, marking the passage of time, each second a reminder of both the past and the future. For years this clock had been a fixture in the bakery, an heirloom passed down from his late wife, Annie. He had never truly paid much attention to it, only acknowledging it in passing as something that had always been there. But tonight, as he stood alone in the quiet kitchen, he felt its presence in a new way. The ticking of the clock was no longer just a background noise. It felt like the heartbeat of the space, a quiet companion to the life he had lived. David's fingers rested on the edge of the counter, and his mind wandered back to the days after Annie had passed. Those years had been long and lonely. The bakery, which had once been a place of shared laughter and warmth, had turned into a silent monument to his grief. He had thrown himself into work, letting it consume him, believing that if he kept busy enough, the pain would fade. But as he looked at the clock now, something inside him shifted. The past, the grief, the loss. It had all shaped him, yes, but it didn't have to define him forever. He wasn't the same man he had been when he first stepped into this kitchen alone, mourning the woman he had loved for so many years. He had found a new rhythm here, not in the quiet solitude he had clung to, but in the bustle and warmth of the family he had begun to build with Ella and her children. David exhaled slowly, his breath soft, almost imperceptible. He had been afraid to hope again, afraid that any dream of a future beyond his pain would crumble like dust in his hands. But here now he realized that hope wasn't something that could be forced. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic change. It was something simple, something quiet like the gentle ticking of the clock, marking the seconds of a life that continued no matter the struggles. He turned his gaze toward the small table in the corner of the room, where Ella and the children had gathered earlier. The echoes of their laughter still seemed to linger in the air. Maisie, Flora, and Toby had become more than just temporary guests. They had become part of his world, part of the rhythm of his days. Even Tessa, who had once kept to herself, had found a way into his heart. And in the midst of all of this, David saw the future that had once seemed so far away. It was a future that wasn't defined by loss, but by the quiet, unspoken connections they had built together. Ella's presence in the bakery, the way the children had woven themselves into the fabric of his life, had breathed new life into the place. It was no longer just a business, it was a home. David's fingers brushed against the clock's worn face, and for a moment he allowed himself to truly feel the passage of time, not as a burden, but as a gift. The future was not something he had to chase or fear. It was already unfolding, right here in this bakery with the people who had slowly come to mean everything to him. He glanced up at the clock again, its hands ticking steadily forward, and in that quiet moment, David realized that while the past would always be a part of him, it didn't have to define his future. There was still so much left to live for. With a deep breath, David felt a quiet peace settle over him. The past, with its memories and its wounds, had shaped him, yes. But it was the present and the family he had found that was shaping his future. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that the future could be bright. He wasn't alone anymore. And together they would build something lasting, something full of hope. David turned from the counter, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He was ready for whatever came next. The soft hum of the bakery had faded into a peaceful silence as the evening wore on. The kitchen, once filled with the noise of baking, was now quiet except for the gentle sound of the old clock ticking. Tessa stood in the corner, her fingers lightly resting on the edge of the counter, her gaze drawn once more to the antique clock on the wall. The light from the kitchen cast a warm glow across the room, and she felt for the first time in a long while a quiet shift within herself. The clock had always been a constant presence, a silent witness to the passing of time. It had been there long before she had opened the bakery, and it had stayed through the years of solitude and loss. But now, as her fingers traced the edges of the time-worn wood, it felt different. The clock was no longer just a reminder of time slipping away. It was a symbol of how much had changed, how much had been healed. She thought back to when she had first walked into this place, carrying the weight of her grief and fear. She had kept everyone at arm's length, afraid to let anyone in, afraid to be hurt again. The quiet, solitary existence she had built around herself had seemed like the only way to survive. But now, standing here, she realized how much had shifted. The family she had been so afraid to build, the life she had been hesitant to embrace was here, right in front of her. Turning away from the clock, Tessa walked to the small table where the rest of the family was gathered. The children were laughing, their voices light and full of joy as they passed dishes around. David sat at the head of the table, his steady presence anchoring them all. And Ella was talking softly to Maisie and Flora, a quiet conversation that filled the room with warmth. Tessa's heart swelled as she looked at them. This was her family now, in all its imperfect, beautiful chaos. The bakery had become more than just a business. It had become a home, a place where laughter and love could grow in the cracks left by old wounds. As Tessa sat down at the table, David's eyes met hers, and in that moment there was an understanding between them. Something unspoken but deep and true. They had both been through so much, and yet here they were together. The wounds of the past still existed, but they no longer had the power to define them. They had found something far more powerful: healing, hope, and connection. The soft glow of the kitchen light spilled across the table, illuminating their faces in a warm embrace. The flickering light from the candles added to the sense of comfort, and Tessa couldn't help but feel that, in this quiet moment, everything had come full circle. What she had once feared, what she had once kept at a distance, was now the thing that had saved her. David reached for her hand, his touch gentle and sure. "This is home," he said, his voice filled with a quiet confidence that matched the peace Tessa was finally starting to feel. Tessa nodded, her hand still resting in his, feeling the connection that had blossomed between them. She had been so afraid to let go of the past, so afraid to trust again. But now, sitting around the table with her family, she knew that everything had changed. She had found her way back, not just to a place, but to herself. As they ate together, sharing stories of their day and small dreams of the future, Tessa felt the weight of the past finally start to lift. It wasn't gone, but it no longer ruled her life. There was something else now, a quiet joy that came from simply being here, being together, and knowing that this was where she was meant to be. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passing of time, but this time it didn't feel like it was running out. It felt like it was moving forward, carrying them all towards something better. And in the warm light of the kitchen, Tessa realized that she had found more than just a family. She had found a future filled with hope, healing, and the quiet comfort of knowing she wasn't alone anymore. The light from the kitchen spilled out into the quiet night, a beacon of warmth and possibility. And for the first time in years, Tessa felt the gentle pull of peace settle over her heart. As the last crumbs of dinner were cleared away, the kitchen settled into a scene contented quiet. The flickering light from the oven cast warm shadows across the room, and outside the stars began to appear one by one, as if to remind them that there was always more to come. David stood by the counter, his eyes lingering on the family gathered around the table. Ella was talking softly to the children. Maisie was sketching something in her notebook, and Toby was already asleep, his head resting on a pile of napkins. For the first time in a long time, David felt a peace settle within him that wasn't just temporary, it was real. He looked over at Tessa, who had been so quiet recently, and for a moment their eyes met across the room. Without a word, she stood and walked over to him, her hand brushing his as she joined him at the counter. Together they watched the family, the hum of the bakery now more of a song than just a background noise. Tessa smiled softly. "This is what home feels like." David nodded, the quiet words carrying a weight of truth they hadn't said out loud before. It was a new beginning, not just for the bakery, but for them all. And just as the last light dimmed in the room, a single plant, small and green, was placed carefully by the window, a new life growing slowly but surely, symbolizing the journey ahead. If this story resonated with you, if you felt that little spark of hope, don't forget to like and subscribe. Join us for more moments like these, because sometimes the smallest things grow into something beautiful.